A little bit of history about how we got to where we are and why some of our teachings might be archaic, different, and shrouded in mystery, and how to demystify it. That is not the plan. Okay, so the first thing when it comes to acid-base is the two philosophical components, and that's Hickham's dictum. I'm sure everyone's compared it to Occam's razor before. Just before I continue going on a monologue, can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Conrad, and you're coming across perfectly, so keep going.
Cool. So the two ones I refer to most is Hickham's dictum and the illusion of explanatory depth. Now, Hickam said, he's the guy that said a patient can have any disease he damn well pleases, and I kind of think he used that expletive, which just explains that once you try to explain acid, base, and gases, there are 2, 3, maybe even 4 different things going on at the same time, and our traditional teaching would not be able to cover that as well. And the one component about the illusion of explanatory depth, it kind of fits in with the thought that you think you know more than you do. When you actually get asked a question, there's a little bike in there. The one person was asked, or 100 people were asked in that study, there's a bicycle, please complete the picture. And everyone said, yeah, I can draw a bicycle. And when they needed to, it was a lot of faults. And the same applies to zippers, toilets, piano keys. You think you've got an explanation in it. And when someone actually grills you to ask this, and I'm sure all the rages, when a student or MO asks you about the gas, you think you know it, and then there's something on the gas that just, I can't explain that fully. And the idea of that is today is to get deeper in depth, and then we can get to explaining why we got there. So in the history of acid-base, there's been fights. How do we evaluate this? There's guys from Denmark, Sigurd and Anderson, which said, no, we're going to use base excess. Then the Boston guys from Harvard said, there's no way we're using base excess. We are using bicarb. And then in the 1980s, a Canadian physician said, I am going to combine my own theory. And then the naysayers said, well, you're just confusing the world. There's so many calculations. It's so difficult. So how do we evaluate acid-base? And how are we going to get a consensus between us all? Now, before I go on, this is an approach combined with my approach, combined with data to support it. And I need you all to do a few things for me to go through this. You forget what you already know. Just for now, at the end, you can remember it all. You think easy. Don't try to overcomplicate it. Think of geometry. Think of shapes, anything that gets you taught. We start with a blank slate. We're only aiming to explain the metabolic contribution for now, and then we don't think respiratory until the end. And this, at the end, we'll compare with what we know. So this is about getting the metabolic contribution. The first thing, there are about 4 things that you see when you start looking at the metabolic contribution. The standard base excess with a little C on it. And you're like, which one am I talking about? And then there's bicarb, and I got taught bicarb. So the idea is, after the best one to use would be to use base excess. Bicarb has been shown to be inconsistent. It's not linear. And there's a study as well that says if the lipid levels are high, in whichever case, then it's really spurious and you can be way off the guard. None of the blood gas machines currently available that I know in the world either measure bicarb or base excess. They're all mathematical models based on the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation or a modification on it. You just take a pH of CO2 and then there's a calculation regarding that. And so we're going to use base excess. And then the next question would be, what is base excess? And just think of a bucket of, if you want to, blood. And the more acidic it is, the more base you must put in 1 millimole per liter. And the more base it is, the more alkaline you must put in. And so it's quite a conceptually easy model. And when we use base excess, which one do we use? We just said there's 4. There's bicarb, then there's another bicarb, then there's a base excess and a standard base excess. So we're going to use the standard base excess, because when Sigurd Anderson first said we're going to use base excess, the first thing the naysayers said was like, well, you did it for blood and HB is a very good buffer, so we're not going to use your algorithm. And then within a year or two, they said, fine, if you think oxygenated HB is a good buffer, we're going to calculate it then for anemic hemoglobin, and that will also give us a better idea of the extracellular fluid component. So the current one we're going to use to be as accurate as we can be is the standard base excess, or the base excess of the extracellular fluid. Now, how to get to things. And to explain this, I don't want you to think in bicarb, hydrogen ions, pH, log K. I want you to think in two towers. And the two towers would be the one with positive charges and the one with negative charges. Not acidic or so, but that they do contribute to the acidity. So on the one tower, we got the positive stuff. On the other tower, we got the negative stuff. And they need to keep a certain distance from each other to keep your base excess 0. Your standard base excess 0. And the components on the positive tower is your sodium, which plays a massive role, so much so that we're probably going to ignore those that are up there. And the components of the other tower is where it all becomes interesting, because chloride is your big player on the other tower. Then lactate, even though you think of it as a big player, it's still on the negative arm, on the right arm of the two towers. Albumin, which is very rare to have the result with you in ED already, but the longer you are critically ill, the lower your albumin probably is, and the more it contributes to your acid base. Phosphate is a very unpopular electrolyte. It's underrated in my opinion, and when you go back to your Guyton and your Ganong physiology textbooks, phosphate is a real buffer, so it does play a role, although the amount would be very little in normal situations. And then comes what else on the negative arm, on the right arm, can be a player. So the difference between these two should be 40, and if you take 100 students, there should be about 40 millimoles or 40 plus minus 4 on both sides, because no human being is the same. There are standard deviations, but because we're going to take away the magnesium, calcium, we're just going to use the sodium for our calculations. We have taken away, and now the number we're looking at is 35. So if everyone's still with me, I'm going to go through examples of how these two play off against each other. So the plan is to see which of the red vial, how big that component is, and how much of the green vial is getting closer or further away from each other. Which one's bulking its muscles way more? So the one's got a Usain Bolt looking contribution, and the other one's just flexing like Arnold Schwarzenegger. So why can it work like this? If you want to go through everything, and that's not the point of this conversation, is the physical chemical properties and laws of mass keeping, laws of electroneutrality. It's there's stuff that we can go through, but it just confuses you if you're not busy trying to explain it. So why it works like this is behind us. Now we can go, when these two face off, these two towers, what is the sodium in relation to chloride? That's the first question we ask. And the normal distance between that is 35. Now, sodium in millimole per liter and chloride in millimole per liter has got a 1-to-1 ratio. So if your chloride is 105 and your sodium is 140, one bump in your chloride towards the sodium would mean a change in your base excess by 1. And why that is important is because your hyperchloremia and all your hyperchloremic acidoses have to be compared to your sodium. And if you see the check one on the top right there, let's see if this works there. So when you do the calculations of how are they versus each other, we were saying 35, and now the fact that it's 25 means that it's more acidic by 10, and that's why there's minus 10. And you can see there as well, they've gone closer to each other. And this is important because the counter can also happen. You can have a hyperchloremia, which is, it's more than the 115 we had before, and now it's higher. So technically you should have a hyperchloremic acidosis, but that has stayed the same because that is also increased, if we can understand that part. So when you say the two have to play off against each other, the sodium versus the chloride, and not the chloride as a hyperchloremia per se. Right, let's get back to a relatively normal sodium and chloride. Now the second component is what is lactate doing to the arm. And the reason why we choose lactate, let's go back one, sorry, is because lactate is the #1 cause of metabolic acidosis. High anion gap metabolic acidosis, the first point of call is usually lactate. And there's a lot of discussion about type A and type B lactate, which I'm sure you know. But the second question would be, what is lactate doing towards this acidosis? And that's at a ratio of normal would be 1, and anything above 1 contributes 1-to-1 ratio again. So that should go forward, sorry. Am I going forward? Backwards. Sorry about that. New iPad playing game. Right, sorry. that way. So lactic acidosis is the most common cause of metabolic acidosis, right? And it's a one. So if you look at check 2 on this side, you'll see that because it's lactate is 6 in this example, the contribution towards base excess is -5. Now, once you pass this stage, then becomes albumin cannot be ignored as a contribution to your acid base, and that is important when if you've ever done an anion gap, which every single one of you have, there's also a contribution to albumin corrected. And that reason is because albumin is a massive buffer in your system, and this becomes important in the critical ill or the chronically ill component. And then the albumin, how far it is from your normal, contributes only a quarter to how big or small the other arm is. I hope you guys are with me already. We'll get all this together in the end. So your first checkpoint is how in the 2 towers, what the sodium chloride is doing against each other. Can you explain everything with that? The second checkpoint is what's your lactate doing, and can you explain it by the lactate? And the third one, if it's not making sense, you can go look at the albumin. Now, like I said, the difference in the albumin, its contribution to the height of this is only about a quarter strong. So whatever your number is, you're going to take a quarter of that. So in the ED situations, not that big a role. If you've got a hyperacutely ill patient, albumin is a negative phase reactant and drops in acute illness, but it doesn't drop to a high degree to make a big difference unless you're dealing with a critically ill or chronically ill malnourished person. How much is the phosphate contributing? And that there's no contribution for yet. And like I said, if you're not dealing with a chronic renal failure with a massive phosphate, or a person who's phosphates through the boots from a syndrome where they just use it all, or it shouldn't be a big problem in your ED evaluation. However, in the critical ill patient, we do look at phosphate to look at the ratio against each other. And then only now we get to the high anion gap stuff. And the reason why it's not done as an anion gap in this stage, what brings this closer to that side? So all your stuff in terms of the normal mnemonic we use, or the memory aid of mud piles, is now a little bit mud pies because the lactate's here already. You can keep the L if you want. There's no problem with that. But because we looked at lactate second, whatever's going to bring that one closer to the other would be mud pies. And they keep the methanol, the urea. Long discussion about how interesting it is if urea is actually toxic. The D for the ketones from DKA, propylene glycol, isoniazide. You guys all know that one. So that is not anything. So this would then get to the mud pies. So to recap, to explain your acid base, and we're going to go through an example now. The column on the left and the column on the right should be equidistant to each other with a gap about 35. Once you become acidotic, they get closer to each other. Now, the relation of closer to each other is more important than the one just climbing towards the other. And once you get alkalotic for multiple reasons, you go normal sodium, super low chloride, albumin is low, then you develop alkalosis. And we said in the ED, it's going to be different to this. Would be the ICU model, because when a patient hopefully gets to ICU, you'll definitely have that. You've got time to look for that, and you've got time to look for that, just to see if it's the amount. We've got a formula for this one in terms of ratios. We've got a formula for this one. We've got a formula for this one, and these two, the contribution are unformulated, but you can postulate. So this would be the ED version. Now think about it. If you see a gas in front of you, the examples we're coming to, the first thing you look at on the gas now to try to find out what the base excess is, to look at your sodium versus chloride. And the amount of that contributes, you then look at the lactate, and if those two don't answer your question, then you go look for other reasons of high metabolic, or high, what we usually call the high anion gap metabolic acidosis. I'm going quick and I'm going on my own. Is everyone still there?
We are still here. I mean, obviously, for those of you that aren't aware of Stuart's or haven't gone through some of the pre-reading, you know, it might not make immediate sense, but you know, it's another way of approaching as opposed to the Henderson-Hasselbalch or Sigurd-Andersen, and it's a way of determining. I mean, we're looking at an anion gap in another sort of way and explaining it through the strong ions and dependent variables and independent variables. So, but I mean, for me, I understand. Go for it, Cameron.
Conrad, I just got a question to ask before you go on. I noticed you haven't made mention of particularly the strong ions and that kind of thing. From what I've read, phosphate wasn't included as a strong ion. Or, I mean, I see you've included it in your, is it the same dissociative qualities as the other strong ions, so chloride as well as lactate in terms of phosphate, and given the same sort of level of phosphate in terms of 1-to-1 ratio? So 1 millimole of phosphate that goes up is equivalent to the sodium on the opposite end.
No, so it doesn't have the same ratio, but it has got a bigger effect than when you go through in the ICU level or the later level, not ICU necessarily. If you got all the results with you, when you start going through this formula, you start seeing, when you go to the next step, you see phosphate and it does fit in. So the amount of dissociation from water and its electrochemical properties does not complete to a 1-to-1 ratio, but it is something that to explain that you have to go look at it when you are not reaching your targets, or if you're starting to explain your base excess.
Got it. Thanks.
And I think for the guys listening in, I think also this is part of it is explaining each component of your base excess. And this, the Stewart's method is explaining each of those individual components as we go through.
Yeah, we got examples in the end, and hopefully that can explain it nicely if people can follow until now. Don't be shy to ask, because this is a unique way of approaching it, and it's a little bit different than we were taught before. So this would be the ED's version. Your first step to getting what's my base excess, I like this pen, would be, this is my first point of call to try to explain it. This would be my second point of call to try to get to it, and then we'll get to the others, while you consider these normal. If you were going on PalmCrit or Internet Book of Medicine, and this is the old way you did it, I've tried to avoid doing it because that confuses the buckets out of everyone and me. So this would be, after you've approached that, I'm going to go through the examples, how acid base could be explained in context of what we were previously taught. Right. So we get taught a high anion gap metabolic acidosis, and we get taught a normal anion gap metabolic acidosis. And I'll go through a formula now just to explain why these can be used interchangeably with this method. Because if you can go through this method, and the first thing you see is that the sodium and the chloride on its own explain your base excess, then you've got the pure anion gap metabolic acidosis, the normal anion gap metabolic acidosis, meaning that the acidosis that you're seeing is explained by the ratio of sodium versus chloride alone. Very important context, in context of normal saline 154 versus 154 volume resuscitation, because this is where you start seeing the difference there. And then you can use whatever mnemonic you use to try to say, okay, I've got my sodium chloride explain my acidosis. Now I can look for the cause of that acidosis that fits in with whichever mnemonic I like. Okay. The second part is, what happens if the acidosis is worse than being explained by the sodium versus chloride ratio? And when that is worse, then we consider that there's anion gaps, or there's other content, other acidic content making that gap closer and more acidic, and that's when you get to the mud pies and mud piles. The third way is the third way would be, both contribute together, then that's a mixed metabolic acidosis, meaning there's both the sodium and the chloride and the mud pies are going to explain my base excess. And then there's a fourth one where you're supposed to have a background metabolic alkalosis. When you do the sodium versus chloride, you see that they are far apart, but the patient's still acidotic. How can we explain this? So let us try and think about questions that you probably had until now. When you go through this theory, you should not think of bicarb as a mechanism, as an exchange mechanism, as a buffer in itself. It is a buffer, but when these things change that we discussed now, your bicarb will change in numbers as a result. I.e., if the towers get towards each other, you'll get acidotic and the bicarb will be low. If the towers are away from each other, we'll get alkalotic, and the bicarb will be then high and filling that. Don't think of it as a mechanism. Think of the number you're seeing as the result of the other role players. And that's why in the hybrid theory or Stewart's theory, he thinks bicarb is a dependent factor. It is dependent on what other things are doing. So where does the anion gap fit in all this? Because we were taught anion gaps. I'm just getting back to explaining how this model can work. So when you do the anion gap, as you've all done, and textbooks can say 8 to 12 is your normal anion gap because we use the sodium and the chloride. And then there's a mathematical normal range. Now, some textbooks will say 8 to 16. Then you start adding albumin with. Now, what's good about this and what's bad about this? The good side, you've got all these things on your, you got measured, you got calculated. And then on the gas, and you can say, okay, this is anion gap positive, high or low, or high or normal. Now, if we think about what's the normal bicarb, 22 to 28, some people will say, I'm happy with that. So let's use 25 as our number. Now, we just went through a model where your normal gap is 8 to 12, and we said on a 1-to-1 ratio, sodium versus chloride happens there. Do you see what I'm getting at? So if you say the middle of those are 10, then instead of doing the anion gap to add for that and to get a normal ratio, you can skip that and go straight to the sodium and chloride, what they're doing to each other. And then because 35 minus 25 would fall in that gap. So this doesn't throw away the anion gap altogether. It just says, why even do a range when sodium and chloride have a 1-to-1 play against each other? And bicarb is not a measured tool in normal acid-base blood gas analyzers. So this just explains that you can do that technically an anion gap, but you use your measured anion gap anions at a 1-to-1 ratio. Now, I've not touched pH yet, and the following examples will get to it then. Now, once you've decided what your metabolic component to this gas is, you need to decide what the mechanism is: counterproductive, positive productive, pure. What is the CO2 doing? Because you can't talk about the pH without talking about the interaction between the metabolic component and the respiratory component. You cannot go without them being compared all the time, and that's why I've actually got a problem or an argument against criteria for things like the DKA having a pH, because the CO2 will influence it. You cannot necessarily say the pH means you're acidotic. It means you're acidemic, but there's role players. So any criteria that says pH is a criteria, it's got too many variables to say that you've got a unique process going on there. And this is not new. Winter's formula. Now, even though I said bicarb is not the game changer in this situation, there's no formula for base excess use at the moment, and it gives you a good enough range to give you an idea. So I'm not going to attack Winter's formula. Everyone knowing Winter's formula, getting us to what my expected CO2 would be for given the bicarb or the gas. Everyone with me to go through an example? I lost some people. If you've written down your question, I'm very happy to answer it in the end.
No hands up at the moment, so let's hit the first one, Conrad.
Okay, so first example, and we said our process towards this is you can look at the gas in your old way, which I assume you've already made up your approach to this and you know what's contributing and you know what the process is, and that's fine. But let's try looking at it in a different way. It's just a challenge to see, okay, so we've decided that we're looking at the base excess of the standard base excess or the base excess of the extracellular fluid. Yeah, it's underlined there. Now, how are we going to check which component is contributing to this acidosis? Because we know it's acidosis. We do a little calculation and we say 140 and 107 should be 35, but it's closer to each other. So there's a small contribution of -2. Now, with normal range of base excess, no one get excited about that. That is near normal. No one would worry about that. The second check would be lactate, and now the lactate, anything above 1 contributes. So the 10.1, meaning that the contribution is -10 to each other, meaning that the total, that to that, should be 13.5. And we are at 10.9. That's a difference about 2.6, right? I don't have the albumin and the phosphate yet. So you're off by 2.6 only. 2.6 base excess to be off. I can explain this, and I think if everyone understands this, then you're happy. I'm going to accept that as you can go look for your albumin later, and you can go look for other reasons why it's a bit higher than expected. But from ED, I'm going to say the sodium, the chloride is not contributing to this acidosis. The lactate is. I don't have to check for mud pies because the base excess is as low as as normal, as close to the base excess as it can be. Now I apply Winter's formula. We say the CO2 is in range, because if you do that formula to that bicarb, that is very close to being in the range where we think it was normal. So in essence, we've got a pure lactic acidosis, pure metabolic acidosis with good adequate compensation, single pathology. Is everyone following the train of thought on this example now? Any questions on this example so long before I go?
I think everyone's got it, but if anyone else wants to say yes or a shout out, that's cool too. I think that's good, Conrad.
Okay. This is where it gets tricky, because if you look at example 2, if you the first time you've ever looked at a blood gas and you walk straight out of university and you think you're on top of this, you look at that pH and say, I remember the pH, and that pH is normal, this patient is fine, right? But as emergency physicians, we know a little bit more than this, so we're going to go through and check every component. So following the same formula, we're going to check what is the sodium versus chloride in this patient. And with the sodium being here and the chloride being way low, that would have meant that this patient is alkalotic. If we were going to say sodium on this side and chloride on this side, that gap is big. So it's way more than 35. So if this patient had one single pathology between sodium and chloride, that base excess would have been plus 17. You'd have a massive metabolic alkalosis. But now a second check comes like, what is the lactate's contribution to this? Because if you look at the base excess, that's not explained by that. So what's check 2? So that is a massive, everyone can explain that lactate is dangerously high. It is one of the biggest you'll see when you see patients. And then you're like, but why are you not that acidotic if your lactate is that high? Because according to my normal teaching, lactate's acidic and it should cause a massive metabolic acidosis if that's the normal lactate, but this is the acidosis I'm seeing. Why is the difference? And the difference would be because of your sodium and your chloride being between each other. So you started off with that difference. Now you see the lactate, if it was pure and everything else was, if the sodium and the chloride were equidistant from each other, you would have a base excess about minus 22. But because you don't start there, those two have come together and said the base excess should be, if it's explained between your sodium, your chloride, and your lactate, minus 5. Again, in this example, we don't know the albumin and the phosphate, but we still need to go look towards getting some little acidosis there. We still need about minus 3.6. So because we're still 3.6 off, I would then look at this patient saying, this is the kind of patient that I want to know the phosphate of. I want to know the CMP, but I definitely want to know the urea and to see how we got to this lactate. We need to explain, it's not the furthest off, but I need to explain either by checking his U&Es, seeing if he's in renal failure, checking his ketones, checking is there any drugs involved, why am I not there yet? And 3.6 is not too much. It's probably not the best example to do that. So after those checks, then we're like, okay, we've gone through the metabolic component. The CO2, once we do Winter's formula, should be about 30.2. And this is the CO2 we're getting at the moment. Meaning this patient's got 3 pathologies in one gas, and that's why if you close and look at the pH, you're like, oh, this patient should be fine. He's got 1, a background metabolic alkalosis, as explained by the sodium and chloride difference. He's got 2, a massive metabolic acidosis, lactate-induced. We don't know about 3 and 4 at the moment. And then he's got maybe there, but his CO2 is not in range, so this is not pure. He is hyperventilating for a reason. And this is not the type of gas that you see in kids necessarily, but when you take a gas and the patient's huffing, puffing, is going way quicker than we expected, there's a third pathology that would explain your pH instead of you just looking at the pH and saying everything's normal. So with that approach,
Conrad?
yes.
So I think Camlin had a question just on, if you go back a slide. Camlin, I don't know if you still want to ask it or whether Conrad covered it.
No, it covered most of it. I just wanted to note, the potassium is also high in this gas. Is that not something, normal potassium changes by 1 or 2, but once you start getting to like 6 and 7, does that not feature also as a strong ion in your thing to explain your base excess even more?
It could, but if the potassium's on this one, so it should make you more alkalotic. So then you should consider that if you're going to use your potassium on this side, then the base excess needs to explain even more.
Yeah.
There's no 1-to-1 ratio for potassium, unfortunately. So you can go and you can add onto your thoughts the potassium is also high, and that means that this example, it's not accurate, this still 3.6. So if you can say, maybe I'm more than 5 off because potassium is also high, but I still need to go try to explain it. So it's a good example of you understanding how the two towers play off against each other. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, thank you.
So when you take all that together, then when you start looking at gases now, old school, pure.
Conrad, we've got another question. Sorry, just while we're there, it seems like it stimulated something. Emily, you want to go ahead?
Yeah.
Oh gosh. Hi, Conrad.
Hi, Emily.
I just wanted to ask.
My name is Conrad.
It's both of us. We just wanted to ask with example 2, if you had used the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation, you would have probably said it was a Hagmer metabolic acidosis with a respiratory compensation and possibly a respiratory component. We would have missed the metabolic alkalosis. How else would you recommend us working apart from using this method and working out the
SID method?
Yeah, sorry. How would you work out the metabolic alkalosis component of it? Does that make sense?
So what the formula of Henderson-Hasselbalch does, it explains some of the difference. It doesn't explain how you got there. So you would be able to say this is an acidosis, but that's one of the problems I've always had with Henderson-Hasselbalch, because when you taught it, you go H2O plus CO2. Forgive me if I write so ugly. H2 CO3, sorry, and then you get CO2, HCO3. So this, what we taught, it just doesn't cover chloride, and I think I don't agree with the formula at all. Remember that it's an in vitro formula. It was done by physicists who looked at it and said, this is an in vivo formula that might explain the dissociation of that inside fluid. Now that is not the only game changer and player in your whole body. So I actually ignore Henderson-Hasselbalch, if that makes sense to you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Because Henderson-Hasselbalch does not include how my potassium, my sodium, there's too many game players, and this is a petri dish lab formula, and it doesn't explain the human body.
Thank you.
I hope that doesn't upset anyone.
I don't think it does. I think we all get a little bit confused by blood gases, and when they get a bit complicated, and trying to explain the individual components in a sort of a stepwise fashion as you have makes sense to me. It obviously is different to what we were taught at medical school, which is probably a bit ancient, especially for me.
Yeah, I think the workaround there for the Henderson-Hasselbalch is that so-called the delta gap.
Yes.
Where you look at your expected bicarb change, which is, once again, as Conrad says, I mean, for me, it's a complete workaround, something that seems to be more mechanistic and you can explain.
Are you talking about the delta gap where you take the ratio on the top?
Exactly. That's
less than 0.8 and all that. So that's all ratios.
Yeah, exactly.
That's all someone went to go mathematically try to get a ratio to explain it without telling us how they got there. And I feel that this approach gives you an idea quickly at the bedside, and you can have, within 5 seconds of looking at that gas, you can start seeing the components playing. And then you can explain it much better. So I've got a unique example, we had a kid who was 6 years old, and I was, as I'm doing adult ICU, I was doing an ED consultant shift for locum, and then suddenly no one was around, and for the first time in 2 years, I saw a kid again, which was kind of a status epilepticus, and we saw the kid, and after getting through his process, he had a lactate of 10, quite a bad acidosis, and along the pediatricians, we were looking at this gas, and I used this method, and they're like, oh, look at the chloride, he's got a hypochloremic acidosis, and it was, I think his chloride was 124, but it also had a sodium of 159. So we approached it, and I said to them, listen, the sodium chloride contribution doesn't explain this, and if the lactate is cleared, his acidosis will come right completely, because the sodium chloride went up in the same ratio. And luckily it was a professional discussion. They thought, let's have a look. And when the patient stopped fitting, his lactate cleared, his base excess went back to normal, even with a chloride of 124. And that just opened my mind again to how we are underappreciating the context, how they play off against each other, rather than just going through how you taught against medical school. So this is a table just explaining everything, same way that we did before. So I haven't touched respiratory acidosis on its own, because that is not a difficult thing for anyone that passed medical school to get through, especially the acute one. If you haven't had time to adjust, your base excess is normal, your CO2 is up, your pH is low, and you've got pure. We've gone through the one form of metabolic acidosis where the base excess can be explained. The CO2 with Winter's formula is in range, and that's a pure metabolic acidosis with your respiratory rate in keeping with your metabolic acidosis. Then we had the metabolic acidosis. We've explained the base excess to a high degree. We've checked that the CO2 is out of range high. That means there are two components to pushing the pH much lower, and these are usually the pHs of less than 7 that we see easily. And we're like, wow, this patient's sick. Yes, he is, but if you can get him through it, focus on both aspects, maybe needing to get off some CO2, this patient should be much better. So that's why there's multiple components in this patient. And there's this example, patient is metabolically acidotic. You look at the base excess, you've explained it via your mechanism, or you haven't yet, and you need to go look for mud pies. He's also hyperventilating, and then you've got multiple components. Now, just on this point, it is very important for us to know in kids. It's a bugbear of mine. When you take a gas on a gastro kid, and they are crying, they're unhappy, they're hyperventilating, one of the most common mistakes we do is look at the pH and saying, oh, the kid's not so bad. But this is the kid that's very sick, and you don't pick it up, because you can explain it by the sodium versus chloride ratio, because it takes late in diarrhea for your lactate to go up, unless you've got dead bowel or really peripheral hyperperfusion. You become very hyperchloremic. Your base excess is explained by it. Your lactate's normal, but then you're hyperventilating. So when pediatricians, or when you're young in this job, you look at the pH like, I'm happy. The kid's pH is 7.3. It's not so bad. But when you go through these calculations, like, oh, it's 7.3 because he was crying when I was doing a gas. This kid's much sicker than we thought. And there are multiple components to his acid-base disturbance, rather than just looking at one. And the same happens for the metabolic alkalosis, CO2. But the problem with that metabolic alkalosis, you can't stop your breathing until a degree where you become hypoxic. So your compensation for metabolic alkalosis in terms of respiration is not the same and can't be explained. Just if you're going to go do this approach, I'm challenging to, I hope you do, I hope it opens your mind towards getting to the reason why this patient's sick. But just remember that if something's wrong with your blood gas, or it doesn't fit in, it's not always the calculations. There's how you take it. There's the differences it makes to get to the machine. There's problems within the machine. Some of them use glass electrodes, some use Clark electrodes. So you have to consider that just because it's not making sense to me now, I need to think, was this sample well taken? I think a previous exam answer or question would have been, what are the metabolic and metabolic changes in a gas sample that's waited too long? So this method should be in a pure sample. The difference between arterial and venous blood gas is not discussed in this. This is just to explain how we got to where we are. And I hope at the end of this, if you look at a gas again, you go and say, I got this. And I definitely understand much better that where we got to this point where we are now.
Thank you, Conrad. I think that was a very, very good way of taking us through it. And I like the examples, and it made it a lot more concrete in my mind. I've used a combination, but I can see the value. I don't know if anyone has any other questions, or if anyone brought some blood gases which they'd like to put on the screen. We did ask if anyone wanted to. David, go for it.
How's it, Conrad? How you doing?
How's it?
Yeah,
I'm so glad to hear. How's it again?
Yeah, I'm sure. So just a quick question about renal failure. I know that early renal failure can give you a raised anion gap. Late renal failure tends to give you, early gives you a normal anion gap, late gives you a raised. I've never really understood why. I don't really know how that fits in with a strong ion difference. I'm not sure if you've come across a lot of this with your ICU time, if you can shed some light on, basically renal failure and how this all ties in with HAGMAs and NAGMAs and strong ion difference.
I didn't know who your face is. You might just, I just like to see who I'm speaking to. This is a weird situation. Can you put on your
pop your camera?
Yeah, should be on. There we go.
McAlpine.
Yeah, lucky on you.
Good. So when we get to that situation, let's just discuss that. I don't know why. What do you see at the moment? My screen.
Just a big
I think
C.
you've just stopped sharing your screen unless you want to go back to the presentation.
No, it's fine. Stop
you
sharing
might.
Screen. I should be.
I should be back. Has stopped sharing. Yeah, there you come.
Okay, cool. So the concept of how renal failure plays into that, and there's multiple components to it. There's the acute versus the chronic renal failure, and it's the components that you need to think of what is causing. If you look at those two next to each other, it's how are they getting closer. So you get the context of the high anion gap, because if your sodium chloride and your lactate are far away from each other in a good range, what fills that to push it closer to get you the base excess explained? And one of the most interesting things I've learned recently is that urea is not as toxic as we thought. When your urea is raised, they've done some studies on animal models and on students in the old days, where they did pure urea, infused pure urea in people, and they were asymptomatic even when the urea hits 60, 70. So what we don't know in renal failure at the moment, and this is a simplified model that I explained, is what urea represents. There's about 140 toxins that we know, but we measure urea. So let's assume you've got renal failure, your urea's jumped up to 40. We are measuring urea, but what also jumps up? And those toxins fill in that gap. So your sodium chloride and lactate will be far away from each other, but you'll be very acidotic. Either from the high phosphate that the chronic guys have, which pushes your right side up, closer to each other, or that gap is full. When we say mud piles, we refer to urea, but it also could be that it's one of those 140 horrible, disgusting things that we've never learned to measure, and we don't know if that's causing problems.
And then why is it sometimes a NAGMA then? I understand how those things would push up because those are sort of exogenous acids or whatever, but why is it that sometimes with renal failure then you just get a normal anion gap? So presumably there's no collection of acids. Is that just because the kidney is not secreting bicarb, or why does that happen?
This model would say that I don't think the kidney and the secretion of bicarb plays a role. I think it's the kidney's chloride management that plays a bigger role. Yes, we taught undergrad the bicarb and the exchange mechanism, but it's the chloride that bothers me more, because we know that hyperchloremic solutions causes renal failure or gets acute kidney injury. So the kidney's management of chloride, then, if you've got a normal anion gap, and if you go through this, then you would see this is the chloride component to it. There is a chloride component to it, and not all human beings are the same. You can have renal failure guys with a normal sodium, little low sodium, little low chloride. This way you can explain this is why the renal failure patient has a normal anion gap, because the sodium and the chloride have climbed up to each other or have come together.
Cool. Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
Cool.
Anyone else with a question? Any blood gases? Anything to stump Conrad?
Yo,
I think
how's it? I got a
Dave's
question.
yeah.
Yeah, go for it.
How's it, Conrad? How's it going?
Couldn't you, Clicky?
Lekker, man. Quickly, just I know like some people like to, look at the potassium when they've got an element on a gas and convert it with the acidosis and see, is this a kind of an expected potassium or is this something that I should just be ignoring? So I think what I'm trying to ask is, when you're looking at your potassium in your acidotic patients, is it something that you should be just looking at trying to correct and trying to work out what the actual cause is? Or can you just say, oh, look, it's probably due to the acidosis and there's no real reference range or formula that I can use to try and work out if it was there before or if it's due to my acidosis?
I would err on the latter, with the fact that we know that once you're acidotic, but it's more like once you're acidemic, the pH environment, then the sodium and then the potassium would shift out. I would look towards my causes using algorithm and then fix the cause. And if the potassium follows, that's fine. If I think the potassium is contributing to my numbers, then I'm to think this was an oversimplified 2-tower model. And if the potassium does jump up to 8, 9, then it will have a role. But because it's not usually intracellular, not an extracellular component, the role wouldn't be 1-to-1. And I've got no ratio. The only ratio that we really know is sodium versus chloride and lactate. They've got a millimole of 1-to-1. I don't know, even though potassium is only one positive ion, I don't know if it has a 1-to-1 ratio. But I would take it into account as one, I'd look for the cause and treat the cause, and hopefully the potassium comes down. And 2, if it stays down, it might contribute to me having a fake metabolic alkalotic component because the 1 tower is going to be higher.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks, man. Thanks a lot.
I think Cameron had his hand up next, and then Emily or John.
Okay, I'll go first then. Conrad, this is a question about kids. I don't think it's specific to kids. I mean, I think the way we understand acid base is probably the same, but it's just something that I've noticed from one of my last rotations. So there's this concept of this. So kids would come in with diarrhea, be quite shocked and quite sick, and have an acidosis. And so at some point, someone would eventually measure chloride and come up with a thing called a chloride-driven diarrhea. But the problem is, so you'd have a higher sodium, you'd have a high-ish chloride, but the ratio changes because your total water, I would assume, has gone down now. But then in order to treat this acidosis, they start giving what they call chloride-free fluids, which essentially is sodium bicarb. Now, I mean, I know that sodium bicarb theoretically will treat an acidosis, but not because of the bicarb, but because you're increasing the sodium relative to the chloride. But that's obviously a short-lived process because you can't tolerate a high sodium. And I got into many arguments trying to figure out if there was such a thing as a chloride-driven thing where you needed to just replace sodium instead of chloride. Because from what I'm aware, the kidneys can handle chloride much better than they can handle sodium because sodium is quite important for your water, within your body, which is also contributed to acid-base status. So, I mean, is there something that where you would give bicarb to an acidotic patient if in a purely water-driven situation?
I do. So with the situation you said is, I think the nomenclature is just different. Chloride-driven, not necessarily that the chloride's driving diarrhea, but the acid is because of the gap closed and the kid's chloride jumped, and it happens a lot in these diarrhea patients. And there's total body water loss out of keeping with your salts and your sodium and chloride, and the chloride goes up. And then how to treat that, and the current solutions we have available, probably the difference between the sodium chloride is not good enough, especially if you're going to use, and I still struggle why the international guidelines use 0.9%, the 154 to 154, because the sodium and the chloride are 1-to-1 ratio. And because you are going to push the chloride up with the sodium, you're going to push the chloride up and the sodium just going to go a little up. So that's the proposed mechanism why normal saline causes acidosis. And I don't know who's done anesthetics here. Once you give saline in a patient, you just start seeing him going a little bit acidotic, and this explains it much better. Now, in terms of the fluid choice with sodium and bicarb, I do. When our patients become very hypochloremic, we've got a 1.26% solution, And instead of giving Hartmann's or Ringer's or something, I run that, and then the sodium stays about where it is. I think the sodium content of that is about 70 with 0 chloride, and the chloride starts dropping. I don't think giving a sodium-containing solution, if you're talking about Tigerberg, maybe, with all respect to Tigerberg, I worked and I really like the solutions they made. They took, I think, 5% dextrose water, put sodabic in, and then there was a ratio to work out what your sodium content would be. And I don't think that's wrong, because your sodium would be closer to the pathological range where you are, and your chloride will just not be supplemented. And hopefully you will start volume repleting with the difference between the sodium and chloride extending, and you're becoming less acidotic. I also don't think that giving the knowledge that we have at the moment of bicarb being toxic intracellularly, there's not enough evidence. I don't think bicarb is as dangerous as we think. That is a very controversial statement, but I do think that you can give bicarb in a safer way than we currently do.
Sure, thank you.
Does that answer your question? Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a longer discussion than that, but it does make sense. But I think the issue I have sometimes is not always working out what the other role players are. I think like treating the chloride or treating the sodium, it doesn't really treat the patient. Sometimes it's the chloride is low because of a process, and that process also affects something else, and let's try and figure out what's the best way to approach this, instead of just a knee-jerk, okay, your chloride is high, you've got diarrhea, here's your fluid that you need. I mean, that's the issue.
There's a good point you make, but there's also a training component, because we're all not. I certainly 5 years ago didn't know what I know now, and I probably could have been the doctor that said, hey, we know the chloride, let's chase the chloride. And I think that's where training and self-improvement and teaching comes into play, because I can completely see a few years ago me making the same mistake.
Thanks.
Emily or John?
It's me again now. It's John. How's it, Conrad? Thanks for the lecture. Look, so my question is with regards to the metabolic acidosis or the metabolic the respiratory acidosis or respiratory alkalosis. There is I'm sure you've always heard the rule, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rule, to see whether it's acute or chronic change. How does that fit within the SID paradigm of the sodium and the chloride, then looking at the lactate, and then looking at any of the other factors? How does that work in, or is there actually any role for that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rule?
Well, I don't necessarily remember off the top of my head the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rule. There are compensation parameters and proposed formulas. Now, all of the formulas are based on physics and science, and they aren't necessarily telling you what's going on in the patient just yet, and they won't be 100% accurate. So from all the gases I've checked now, the way the sodium and the chloride interact with each other is how your body chronically responds to it. My theory at the moment is that your kidneys, we first get taught you get your buffers in your body, your phosphate, your HB, your intracellular, extracellular buffers, and then and bicarb we were taught. But the role of the kidneys handling of chloride, I dare you for a check to go through your chronic respiratory sick patient with a high CO2 and check what the sodium and the chloride did to each other, how they moved closer or further away from each other as the compensation. Now that would see your chronic compensation, right? If you got a high CO2, I don't remember the formula off the top of my head, but there is a chronic compensation, and I think the compensation lies with the sodium and the chloride.
Yeah, I'd have to, I mean, in my experience, I mean, just trying to think now, I mean, the longer you have, for argument's sake, a respiratory alkalosis, for argument's sake, so you're huffing and puffing chronically all the time. So respiratory alkalosis, acute versus chronic. I don't know, so my eyes right now, I mean, if I just think the sodium and chloride difference, is that going to necessarily change? Primarily because the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rules mainly looking at the CO2 level and the bicarb, and obviously we talked now that the SID is not really looking at bicarb, you know. So and bicarb generally is going to kind of remain, if we're going with SID, bicarb is, as you said, it's a dependent factor, not an independent factor. So that it shouldn't necessarily change
Try it.
the sit. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think the strong iron difference, Conrad.
Pardon?
Sorry, I think that the strong iron difference is an explanation for the metabolic component. I think, and you've stuck to the metabolic component of it in your talk. The respiratory side is slightly different, and there are multiple role players. But I think it does explain the metabolic component extremely well. I think it does, where it isn't complete in my mind, is around the respiratory side. But the respiratory side you can explain in other ways, and there are formulas that you can calculate whether it's chronic or acute. But I wouldn't use the strong iron, in my view, to look at the respiratory side. It's mainly to explain that metabolic component.
So I've actually done, I mean, sorry, man, I'm just butting in here. I've actually done what Conrad has suggested. So if you do look at someone with a high bicarb from a chronic, their chloride is down. Because when they compensated, it's the kidneys that are now deciding, well, not deciding, but it goes down to maintain that electron neutrality. You just can't have, so you need, your CO2 is chronically high, therefore you're producing more, or it's dissociating, making more bicarb, and eventually your kidneys will excrete the chloride to keep your sodium. So it happens. You'll see chlorides of like 90 and 80, whatever, if their bicarbs are up. I think it all makes sense. It ties in dependent, non-dependent. I was also always confused as to this, like, it's always seemed people were like, you need to decide chronic, acute, and it's like that distinction is arbitrary. Like one day you can't be acute and the next 2 seconds you wake up and you're chronic. It doesn't make sense. But I definitely have tried that to look at those, it has to make sense. It has to make sense through everything. And it does. You'll find those gases where the bicarb is 34 and then your chloride is appropriately low to maintain that electron neutrality and meet up with sodium.
Give it a try. Keep an eye out. Once you start using it, then you start noticing these things.
Yeah, it's infectious.
Let's not talk about infections. We're avoiding it.
Thanks, Conrad, and thanks, Cumlin. Thanks, Luke.
Thanks, Emily.
Is there anyone else? Any questions?
I think it's clear that we need Conrad back.
Thank you, Conrad. I think we've all had a little bit of fun. I think we've all followed it reasonably well. Obviously, it's not the easiest format to get that sort of transfer and direct feedback back. But thank you for your time. Thank you for your effort. And it's always good to see your face.
Let me leave you with this.
Yeah. You just don't tell me you read that, because I don't believe you.
Can I try to tell you I started and went as far as I could?